stations across Australia. It's time for Nights with Chris Kenny.
For my next guest, Bettina Arndt, who's in the studio with me. She's just got this new book out, the hashtag Men2. Bettina, it's a cracker of a title.
Yeah. Well, it was very much designed to get up certain people's noses.
See, the hashtag only really works on Twitter, right? But have you seen the hashtag Men2 actually trending on Twitter? Is it getting a mention there?
Oh, well, I'm the top-selling book in gender studies on Amazon in Australia. How do you like that? I think it's really funny that it's in gender studies, actually.
Well, I suppose, yeah.
That will really annoy the feminists too, won't it?
Well, there's a lot of people studying gender studies, so that's probably a big category. Yeah, it'd be interesting, actually, whether your book is going to turn up in those gender studies classes. I imagine
I doubt it.
Well, I think they'll ask their students to pull it apart, won't they? Or do you think they'll just ignore it?
They ignore it. I mean, they don't talk about anything that doesn't fit the party line. I mean, that's the trouble with the gender studies courses. It's just total ideology, never discussion of proper, to and fro on evidence. They're not remotely interested in evidence. It's just cramming ideas down people's throats. And,
we're going to get to some of the specific issues that you've been dealing with and some of the responses you've been having in just a moment. But first up, just to set the scene, I find your career quite remarkable because I've seen it. I've known you for a little while now, but of course I watched you from afar since I was a teenager in public debate. And in the early days, you were seen as this radical, I would say even a radical feminist, because you dared to talk about sex. You dared to talk publicly about women making sure they got a good deal out of sex, about how women dared to make sure that they could reach orgasm and the rest of it, things that were, back in those days, no one would dare talk about. And of course, you've been prominent in debate since then. But here you are now in 2018, actually arguing that it's men that have been hard done by, and that the whole debate has shifted against them.
And, it was a logical progression because I did start out working for women. I was very excited by the women's movement. I wanted to do something to help women. But I was one of Australia's first sex therapists and working mainly in the media, out there on television and radio, talking about sex. And inevitably what happened is men started to talk to me as well. And everywhere I went, men talked about their lives and talked about their sex lives, but also told me what else was happening. And I started to realise there were a lot of really horrible things happening to men. I mean, I suppose one of the first areas I did a lot of work in was the family law area, and this was back in the 1970s, when, it's hard to imagine, but things were even worse in many ways for men then. I mean, there was just an assumption that women...
A lot of horrible things happen to women too, right? But you don't deny that.
The family law is supposed to be a fair deal for men and women. And back in those days, in the 1970s, there was just an assumption that mothers are the main parents, that children automatically go to their mothers. I just started to write about this. And I got a letter from a retiring family court judge who said, "You're totally right. We made a huge mistake." He was in the part of the family law system from the very beginning when the Family Law Act was first introduced. And he said, "We gave all the power to the custodial parent, and that's usually the mother, and it's often been misused, that power. Women had the right to move wherever they liked, to stop fathers seeing their children, whatever it was." And I got involved under Howard. I was on a whole range of government committees looking into family law, representing men, funnily enough. Howard was a very interesting Prime Minister from my point of view because he was interested in fathers, and he spoke out a lot about the importance of fatherhood. And he deliberately put me on committees because he knew the Femocrats, all these big government committees are run by feminist bureaucrats these days, and they make decisions. They used to put the worst possible representatives from the men's groups on these committees. And funnily enough, Howard sort of people got me in there just to balance things up a bit, because it was the lone parent group, the lone mum groups are just formidable. Professional women doing a really good job, lobbying for their side. But men tend to fight, for instance, family law battles with expensive lawyer if they can afford it. They just do their own thing on their own. They don't join groups.
Don't get together. Yeah.
They don't.
Let's hold that thought. A fascinating background there. There's about 1 million questions jump into my head just from that opening salvo. I'm joined in the studio tonight by prominent sex therapist, writer, author, commentator Bettina Arndt about her latest book, #Men2. I'm going to ask you about the pink test in just a moment, Bettina. I've been reading about it in the introduction to your book, but I wanted to go to this caller first. Michael's on the line from Campbelltown. Hi, Michael.
Hey, how you going, bud?
Good. You got a question for Bettina?
Yeah, I was just sort of wondering, anything with the family law and everything, going into the security of fathers with, so my experience, Dad, they had a pretty okay relationship, sorted out an outside agreement. They sort of arranged, without going to court, without going to family law, and arranged to be able to have sort of, a good relationship custody sort of agreement.
Yeah.
And then out of the blue, she had the ability to, while I wasn't staying with her, demand requests for Centrelink payments, or the father's payments, or I forget the name on the spot. But yeah, I was wondering if my dad tried hard and just heard no support or anything from Centrelink.
Yeah.
And also Centrelink asking for retrospective payments.
Look, it's very tricky because it can be if your circumstances change, you can argue that you should have been paid more over a certain period, even if it was retrospective. And it can be very tough. One of the things that's always bothered me in regard to child support is that they make an assumption about what a man can earn, but if he loses his job or if his salary goes down, often he's expected to keep paying that amount for a significant period, or the amount of assets, the way the assets have been divided up is dependent on his income at the time of the divorce, and then that can change. And I know a lot of older men who have divorces, there might be, say, an executive in his 50s, he loses his job, he's given away, she's got 70% of the assets because he was earning so much, and then he's really up against it. There are so many things about family law that are so frustrating, Michael. I can understand how difficult it is.
Thanks, Michael. Your call tends to amplify Bettina's point that often men are the ones who lose out. We'll just go to Claire on the North Coast here with this. Another question for Bettina. Hi, Claire.
Yes, my son has orders to see the children. He hasn't seen them for 8 months. The ex-wife just says, no, you're not seeing the children, that's it. He went to court, and the court just is not prepared to enforce these orders, and the judge just says go and get new orders.
I've been fighting about this for 30 years, writing about it. The fact that the family court is unable, or it just doesn't want to enforce orders. They're always nervous about putting women into prison because they're the mothers of the children and so on. But it is just outrageous that a court can make orders and have them flagrantly flaunted by women again and again, and there are no repercussions for that.
Yeah, well, these orders cost $200,000 in over 3 years, and it was a week and a half in court. So these orders were hard fought. Yeah.
It's just so maddening.
And what a terrible outcome. Not getting to see your children. What could be worse?
I know. It's just appalling. And often that applies to you too, Claire. Often the grandparents don't see the kids either.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, he had constant access for 5 years, and then all of a sudden she just says, no, you're not getting them.
Yeah.
Yeah, how terrible. Thanks for sharing that, Claire. I'm going to go to your book and ask you about the pink test. The other thing I want to ask you about, when you talk about your history as being the nation's first sex therapist, I just want to know what it's like being a sex therapist. What do you do? Well, I'll come back to that if we have time. But in the introduction to your book, you were talking about how you turned up at obviously the Sydney test, which starts in the new year. The pink test, obviously in honour of Glenn McGrath's wife Jane, who died from breast cancer. And quoting from your book, you say, everywhere you looked there was a sea of pink with the largely male audience decked out in pink shirts, jackets and silly hats. Yet this great display of men's natural chivalry and kindness left you frustrated. I spent the whole day, you say, recording interviews for a YouTube video asking men in pink why men's lives don't matter. That's not really the case, is it? Just because they're looking to support a women's health charity doesn't mean that men's lives don't matter to them.
The funding for breast cancer is so disproportionate to the funding for other cancers, and men are more likely to die of cancer than women are. At the time, the pink test was raising money for breast cancer nurses, and we already had hundreds of breast cancer nurses around Australia, and there were 28 prostate cancer nurses. Men desperately need help to regain their sexual functioning after prostate cancer treatments, and they're not getting it. And this is something I've been campaigning on for years. It's a really difficult area to even get men to talk about. I once gave a talk to the National Press Club about why a breast is worth more than a penis. I mean, because it's an extraordinary thing.
I wonder, you mentioned earlier when it came to family law matters that single mothers or single women or divorced women got together and get organised, and therefore their lobbying power is stronger. Is it a bit the same even when it comes to charity? Women get together, they get organised around that, naturally perhaps more social, get more organised around these campaigns, therefore are successful, while men perhaps when they're hit by a disease tend not to.
Well, that's part of it, but it's also that there are men in power are constantly virtue signalling and trying to prove their credentials and win the women's vote by doing good things for women. And that's one of the problems, that men are always selling out other men. Look at Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, his first big act in office was to promise a huge amount of funding for domestic violence, which he said was all about respect for women. He knew perfectly well that domestic violence is a really complex problem with a range of underlying causes, from drug and alcohol abuse to mental illness to, to socioeconomic background, you name it. And he knows that absolutely, that research, but he again and again went out there and said, no, it's all about the way, little boys are taught to treat little girls.
Yeah, that really worries me. Some of those advertising campaigns that somehow little boys, playing with the wrong toy leads to domestic violence.
And it's a
really
lie.
Insidious.
David Leyonhjelm has had the bureaucrats in Senate estimates and it's grilled them about what research there is to support that advertising campaign, and there is none.
It's virtue signalling, like you say. Another one that falls into this category that we're going to hear a lot more about between now and the election, of course, is Bill Shorten going on about the gender pay gap, which a lot of researchers say simply does not exist in terms of like for like. In fact, it's against the law now, of course to pay someone less because they're a woman. But Bill Shorten is campaigning out strongly on that, saying that he's essentially going to lift women's pay.
He said, last International Women's Day, Bill Shorten said no more budgets for blokes, no more justice for blokes, no more rules and regulation. I'm really worried about a Labor government, because I've watched Labor again and again come in, and when there's been advances in terms of just treatment for men and women, Labor has turned them around to favour women at the expense of men.
Have you had a bit of a look at the gender pay gap? I know there's various economic studies have looked at it, and of course what most of them show, in a country like Australia, of course it'll be different country to country, but in Western liberal democracies like Australia, women, sure, because of having babies and other pressures, might drop in and out of the workforce. Some therefore work part-time.
We do half as many hours.
And when you adjust all that, like for like, there's no gender pay gap.
I mean, there's a famous study using Uber, which, how could you possibly discriminate? You don't know whether it's going to be a male or female who turns up.
Yep.
And it's all to do with the patterns of women's working as drivers for Uber. They do less hours. They do less nighttime shifts. They do,
no one orders up an Uber saying, get me a female driver.
And so the men earn significantly more on Uber, just as they do in other professions, because they do more overtime. They do all the horrible, dangerous, difficult jobs in our society which earn big money, like mining and,
Why do we have a campaign for 50-50 representation, men and women in Parliament? I've got nothing against that except making it a quota. Of course, if it turns out to be 50-50 or even in balance, who cares? But why isn't there a campaign for 50-50 garbage truck drivers or building site workers or
of course
delivery van drivers?
There is now for the police force, and therefore they're bending the rules for entry into the police force. A policeman wrote to me the other day and said, they don't have to jump over fences anymore or lift a man's body weight. They don't tell the burglars they're not allowed to jump over fences anymore just because a female policeman is chasing them, or that, if you're hit in the course of, duty, if you're injured in some way, that you can't be your colleague is not going to be able to rescue you anymore. I mean, I am getting letters from people across Australia who've just had enough of all of this. That's what #MenToo is all about, that the feminist movement has gone too far. It's no longer about equality. It's about unfair treatment for men. It's about male bashing.
There is a lot of male bashing. There's the horrible term toxic masculinity. Somehow it's not a good thing to be masculine, even though we would have thought that blokes are supposed, some of those masculine characteristics, strength, courage, reliability, they're supposed to be valued.
What about rescuing children from caves? Yeah. Huh? I didn't notice many women there, did you? You name it, the really difficult jobs are still being done by men. Someone was suggesting we should have a, no men at work day. And we'll see how our society continues to function.
Men on strike. All men could go on strike. That would be good. We've had sort of women-only days in the media.
Yeah,
let's have all the blokes go to the pub day. That would
what a good idea. Well, you're not men aren't allowed to go to the pub. Men aren't allowed to do anything anymore. One of the things I wrote about in my book is what's happened to men's leisure time. Men used to be allowed, because they worked hard, don't bother Dad, he's had a hard week. Dad would go, sailing at the weekend or play golf or tinkering.
Sunita, I hope you're listening.
Tinkering with a car, whatever it was. And men's leisure time has been shrinking since the 1970s. And, of course, all we ever hear about is how hard women work, and they do all the housework. And if you add paid and unpaid work of men and women in Australia, we do almost exactly the same amount of work.
There you go.
We never hear
Fighting
that, do
for
we?
men. I've got Bettina Arndt, the author of #MenToo, with me in the studio. We're talking about how men are apparently being attacked by organisations, by politicians and by women day in, day out in the modern age. Wendy's on the line from North Lakes. Hi, Wendy.
I don't think men are being attacked. I mean, men have it over women. They've got superior strength and they've got credibility. A woman won't be believed, but a man will be.
Well, I don't think that's true. Look at what about #MeToo, where women are being telling stories with no proof whatsoever, and getting those accusations spread across the media, destroying men's careers. You don't think they've got credibility, these women?
Probably some of them have,
and
I know that some people might lie about such things. But
why are the stories not being challenged then?
Men are more, as a gender, they've got more cohesion among them than what women have.
Well, no, we've had a very powerful women's movement for many years that, it has achieved an enormous amount. I mean, I was part of that in my early days. But you don't think... Look at what girls are doing in schools. They're absolutely trouncing boys these days. They're winning all the prizes. We've got 60% of girls graduating from university compared to 60% of the graduates are female. It's very hard to find a single area where women aren't dominating men now.
Well, I don't want to argue with you about that. I still reckon that men have more credibility than women.
Thanks for your call, Wendy. I appreciate your call. I think in some situations people are believed equally by gender, but in other situations I think there is a bias towards believing a particular gender, and certainly when it comes to sexual harassment claims and the rest of it, if a woman makes a complaint, the general bias across the community seems to be to believe them. You believe the complainant. I don't know how you deal with that.
This is the
believe
campaign.
The victim. Yeah,
believe the victim campaign.
It gives you an enormous amount of power if that complaint is not.
And I just think the Me Too campaign has been appalling. I mean, it started off with a really serious issue, the Harvey Weinstein accusations, but it's morphed into this, real witch hunt, often involving quite trivial accusations. If you look at health funding for men, there were women's health units, there are women's health, huge amounts of research going into women's health. If you look at some of the specific areas where we have concerns about men's health, they're not getting nearly as much funding. Male suicide rates, 6 out of 8 of the people who kill themselves every day are male. And there's no decent research going into why
right?
that is.
3/4 of all suicides are male.
And you don't know that, do you, Chris? Because it's never talked about.
Yeah, well, I imagine if those stats were around the other way, it would be a national scandal, and people would want to know why.
And I've been fighting with the national suicide prevention bodies for years, saying, why aren't you talking about this more? And they say, oh, well, women are tempted as much as men do, as if there isn't a difference there who actually achieves suicide, and the fact that there are all these men and their families lost to us.